Welcome to the neighborhood, Hapi Hood the podcast, where we deliver meaningful content to grow your faith, well-being, and leadership skills. Hey neighbor, I'm your favorite neighbor, Jay Murray, lifestyle coach, inspiring others to develop self-worth through leadership applications that will enable them to live in purpose. Hapi Hood the podcast.
Finish
Message.
what you started.
Welcome back to the neighborhood. Welcome back to Hapi Hood the podcast. I'm your favorite neighbor, Jay Murray. And today's guest is the host of Rethinking Scripture podcast, where he challenged people to rethink what they thought they already knew about the Bible. And speaking of rethinking, he just recently launched a book, Rethinking Rest: Why Our Approach to Sabbath Isn't Working, in which that is out now. So you can definitely pick that up. But please welcome to the neighborhood, my dear friend, Mr. Gregory Hall. How you doing?
I'm good. I'm excited about today's conversation.
Yes, I'm excited about today's conversation for multiple reasons. I have and I know how we met, and it was just so interesting around just you listening to a couple episodes that I did last year just on the topic of rest. And I know it's been something that I have been really looking to practice more, but I would say really trying to get a better understanding. And I like the topic or the title, rethinking, you know, because I believe is not necessarily in my mind just kind of changing your full perspective, or maybe it's broadening your perspective, but rethinking in a way of how can I ask better questions around rest, and really what is it, and what is somewhat the Western view of it, and then what is truly the biblical perspective of it. So I guess let's start from the perspective, why this book? Like, what was the catalyst that really drove you to write a book about rest?
Yeah. So a lot of times, and I've shared this before in different conversations, a lot of times life circumstances will throw you into a topic and then you'll go research it to try and figure out how those two ideas marry together, how it is that scripture can play into something that I'm going through in my life.
Mm,
I was exactly the opposite, non-conventional. I was just going through my master's program, which was a master's in theology, and one of the classes was a Bible survey course. And as a part of that New Testament Bible survey course, we went through the book of Hebrews, and chapters 3 and 4. There's a longer discussion about believers' rest in those two chapters. I just noticed a couple things that I hadn't noticed before as we were marching through the book, which
mhm,
caused me then to, no major life circumstance or crisis about rest or anything happening in my
mhm,
life. I just dove into the study and I was amazed at what I found. And then, interestingly enough, just a few years later, um, the stuff that I had been studying became very practical and applicable to my life through a couple different circumstances. So, yeah, it really was born out of just diving into God's word and noticing a few things,
yeah.
specifically some things that were stated in the New Testament. Oftentimes, New Testament authors will uh, quote or refer back to Old Testament ideas or themes.
Mhm,
And that's what's going on in Hebrews when the author talks about rest is, rest is all the way back to the beginning in Genesis, and
yeah.
it's throughout the Mosaic law. It's just everywhere in
Mhm.
the Old Testament. So,
Totally. So, family, this is truly going to speak to the Bible nerds like myself. you I grew up in church. I have mentioned that timeless. I have mentioned that a lot, and so I'm a PK. But one thing that, and I like the title of your podcast, of rethinking scripture, because until I started really diving deep into scripture and really started to read it, but read it in a way that I was open to not just knowing what the end goal was, you know, but understanding and getting to the character, you know, like really humanizing the character and what was going on, like really truly understand the context of it. And with my own, I guess, journey around rest, I noticed rest, the word rest, was in a lot of scriptures that I read. You know, we talked about, as you mentioned, rest was in Genesis. Um, Jesus talked about rest, you know, when he talked about my yoke is easy and my burden is light, you know, as those that are weary, you can find rest in me. So it was those things that really started to like, I'm getting a better understanding, or I started to really explore the whole concept of rest. So I guess to kind of take maybe a step back and really put things in context, and just kind of going from your title of when you're saying, hey, why we're rethinking and reimagining, I guess, and I'm putting those into it, of
Yeah.
our approach to the Sabbath. So
Yeah.
I guess what has been our approach to the Sabbath, and
Yeah.
maybe another layer of question, which I know we'll get to, is like, how do we remove ourselves from it, or how do we become more aware of it?
Ah, good. Yeah. So for those, and not everybody, especially outside the church, but even inside the
Yeah.
church, not everybody's really aware of
Hmm.
what options there are for Sabbath observance,
Yeah.
either right now or recently. So typically, I in the book I kind of break it into these normal categories of. Let's actually back up just a second before we go into that.
Yeah.
When when I tell people that I've written a book on rethinking rest or a book on the topic of rest, I tell them that it's a biblical theology. In other words, I start in the beginning in Genesis and go all the way through to the end in Revelation. So both
Hmm.
Old and New Testaments. And I'm trying to look comprehensively at the topic. But usually, when I bring up the topic of rest, the typical response is going to be kind of where we've gone so far is
Yeah.
how do we observe the Sabbath?
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah. Yeah.
and when we narrow in on that one little tidbit, we're talking about the fourth commandment, the fourth of the 10 commandments,
Hmm.
found in Exodus chapter 20. They're repeated again in Deuteronomy 5 to the next generation right before they go into the promised land. So,
Hmm.
starting to really geek out here on the
Yeah.
Bible nerd
Yeah.
stuff. But so we have reduced the idea of rest, the biblical concept of rest, to really just that fourth commandment. And so it might be a bit of a paradigm shift, this
Yeah.
conversation. And that's where the rethinking comes in is
Mm.
when we shift paradigms and we're asking you to back away from what you may have already understood about a topic. And typically this fourth commandment has been viewed, in the Old Testament, in a Jewish setting, that would be from Friday night to Saturday night, a 24-hour period of time where people don't do their normal work activity
Yeah.
and fill it in with other types of activity like worship or
Hmm.
thinking about God or just various different avenues.
Hmm.
In the New Testament, church, some people believe that the day has been shifted from Saturday to Sunday. And that's
Hmm.
typically because it's called the Lord's Day in the New Testament. It's the day that Jesus rose from the grave.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Hmm.
and then way back in the 1500s, Martin Luther came up with this idea because he realized people had different work schedules that you could take a Sabbath on maybe a Tuesday or a
Hmm.
Thursday, depending on, how it fit your lifestyle best.
Hmm.
And then that's eventually in our American freedom
Yeah.
movement, that's morphed into, well, I can just sort of do whatever I want and consider it a Sabbath. In other words, it could be like 2 hours on a Wednesday and then maybe
Hmm.
Saturday morning and then part of Sunday afternoon. I can piecemeal something together. Doesn't necessarily have to be 24 hours. These are all just different views of that fourth
Yeah.
commandment.
Hmm.
But when you, and one of the things I noticed in the book of Hebrews study that I did, but that also led me to where you were talking about the statement of Jesus. That's
Yeah.
Matthew 12. Um, he said, "Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden."
Yeah.
And when we read that in modern day, the tendency is to think about our physical weariness
Hmm.
and our heavy ladenness from a physical standpoint. And so a paradigm
Hmm.
shift would be the end of Jesus' statement just a couple verses later, where he says, "Come to me and I will give you rest for your soul." And I'm like, okay, well, wait a minute.
Yeah.
I've been viewing this topic. I've been viewing this topic as a, how do I get my body physical rest concept.
Yeah. Yeah.
And when Jesus goes there, remember Jesus, the guy that calls himself Lord of this topic, the whole Lord of the
Yeah.
Sabbath thing,
Yeah.
right? He's he's laying down some new tracks. And I'm
Yeah.
like, maybe I'm on the wrong path, because I've always thought that this idea is going to be achieved, that I'll find the end goal somehow through one day a week changing the what I do on a regular basis and remembering God. And I think all that's important. I think
Yeah.
obviously we need to have physical rest. But how many times have we had a day off? I'll ask you.
Yeah.
How many times have you had a day off from your normal work, but something's not quite right in your life and your soul's
Hmm.
not at rest? And
Hmm.
it doesn't matter what your daily schedule is. If your soul's not right,
Yeah.
you're not getting rest. It's not
Yeah.
restful.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
very restless.
Exactly. Exactly. It's so it's funny, not funny, as you was just mentioning, and I'm just kind of processing this. So bear with me, family. As I just kind of continue to process this, because it has been something that, when you think about the understanding of like the physical rest, and then also like the spiritual rest, and even the notion of God resting his presence upon us, you know. And I want to, I guess, from your studies, when
Yeah.
we're talking about rest, is it fair to say, especially in the Bible, right? When we're looking at it from a biblical perspective, the context of it could be different in all those different passages, you know. So when you're like rethinking rest, how do we understand, again, we studying from a biblical perspective of rest? I guess the question would be like, how many times rest is not only mentioned, but the context of rest in different passages? Is it the same, or is it different types of rest that is mentioned?
Yeah. That's a great question. And that's that's actually a question that if more people ask that question,
Yeah.
we wouldn't be pigeonholing ourselves into one aspect of what rest is. Because
Yeah.
obviously we need physical rest. But
Yeah.
we need it more,
Yeah.
more often than one day a week. I mean,
Hmm.
we go to bed every night because we're usually exhausted, right?
Yeah.
And so the author in Hebrews, this is one of those things that caught my attention.
Hmm.
He, let me actually just turn there because I want to read it. And it's been a while. And in Hebrews chapter 3 and 4, and specifically, I'm going to be in chapter 4.
Hmm.
He says this. Um, he in verse 9, chapter 4, verse 9, he says, "So there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God." This is near the end of the author's argument, so he's coming to some
Hmm.
conclusions. And in verse
Yeah.
10, he says, "For the one," and this is a confusing statement, so I'll go back and kind of
Yeah.
tell you what I think it means. "For the
Hmm.
one who has entered his rest has himself also rested from his works as God did from his." And the only thing that gives us a clue as to what's going on here is the capital letters, because the capital his, those referred to God. So,
Mm-hmm.
really, what the author of Hebrews is saying is the one who has entered God's rest
Mm-hmm.
has himself, that person has, rested from his own works in the
Yeah.
same way that God rested from God's work. And
Mm-hmm.
so, our rest is similar. What the author of Hebrews is saying is our rest is similar to God's rest. And that just
Mm-hmm.
begs the question, well, when was it when God rested?
Yeah.
And the
Yeah.
biblical record only has one place. It's day
Yes.
7
In
of
Genesis.
creation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's back in day 7 in Genesis. So, really, the question is, what does it mean when God rested on day 7 in Genesis? And I think if we can get a grasp of that, that's what my book tries to answer. If we can get a grasp of
Mm-hmm.
that, then we get an idea from the author of Hebrews that that's the type of rest that we're being beckoned to, that we're being invited
Mm-hmm.
into, not just through
Yeah.
Jesus, but through his ministry. And part of that obviously is going to be a physical rest. Those pictures are important. We know
Mm-hmm.
just from a modern day psychology standpoint and physiology standpoint, if we don't get rest on a regular basis and good quality rest, I mean,
Yeah.
I wear an Apple Watch most of the time, and it tells me not just if I'm asleep, but it tells me when I slept, when I woke up, and
Mm-hmm.
how much deep sleep I got.
Yeah.
And it turns out I'm a crappy sleeper. I didn't know that before. So,
So Gray,
uh,
if go ahead.
I was just going to say it. There's some Old Testament scholars that have done some work recently last
Mm-hmm.
20, 25 years in ancient Near Eastern understanding of what
Yeah.
rest is.
Mm-hmm.
And when we get into that context, we then can begin to understand maybe how we've misunderstood what God's seventh day rest was. Because we assume, if you read most commentaries or talk to most pastors, we assume that God literally didn't do any work for a 24-hour
Yeah.
period of time.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And it's perplexing because number one, he doesn't get tired because he's, all powerful. He's
Mm-hmm.
omniscient. He knew this was happening, so it
Mm-hmm.
didn't catch him by surprise. He doesn't need a day off. And yet that's the way we've labeled what's happening on day 7. And that's, I
Yeah.
guess, the only reasoning why we then um, try and do that on a regular basis is because it was so important to God. But what if
Mm-hmm.
rest in the ancient Near Eastern context meant something completely different and we've just
Mm-hmm.
misunderstood what it was? And so
Yeah.
as you dive into some of those extra biblical ancient Near Eastern texts that the Old Testament
Mm-hmm.
scholars look at, they find pagan stories of pagan gods creating the universe and the cosmos.
Mm-hmm.
And some of those stories, it's not that the Bible copied them, but they're written into
Yeah.
a similar ancient Near Eastern context. So they
Mm-hmm.
have some similarities. And one of the similarities is in some of those extra biblical stories, the pagan deity at the end, he'll create a temple, he'll place his image within the temple, and then it says he rests. And by resting in an ancient Near Eastern context, what's referred to is he begins his rule over the cosmos that he just put organization and structure to. So
Mm-hmm.
resting is a place of ruling. Ruling and resting are synonymous in an ancient Near Eastern context.
Wow.
So if we take that idea, though, and bring it into the biblical story, does it even
Mm-hmm.
make sense?
Yeah.
Well, you've got a God who's given organization and structure to the cosmos. That's clear in the first 6 days.
Mm-hmm.
And then it says he's ceased all the work which he had done. It
Mm-hmm.
doesn't say, by the way, that he ceased all of his work, like he didn't do anything. It just
Yeah.
says he stopped doing one thing. And by saying then he rested, then it's telling us that he began a different type of work, his rule.
Mm-hmm.
And so, what the significance of that story might be, or one aspect of it, is that those first 6 days, those are complete. If you remember, it's described as good all along the way.
Yeah.
And then on the end of day 6, everything was very good. And that's just ancient speak for it's all working properly. Everything is structured and ordered the way it's supposed to be. And no need to go back and redo that. In other
Yeah.
words, God
Yeah.
ceased that work. And because that work is good and done, it begins another
Hmm.
type of work. And if God enters
Yeah.
into his rule on day 7, and the author of Hebrews says our rest is similar to God's rest, that even
Hmm.
makes sense because he invites us into his rule on day 6. He
Yeah.
says, humanity, one of your jobs is to rule and subdue.
Hmm.
And so rest might have a slightly or a dramatically different connotation to it.
Hmm.
It it might be that we find our rest when we follow the order and structure that God's given for humanity and for the cosmos, and we live our life in our gifting reflecting that structure and order. And honestly, when I'm doing that, when I'm not fighting against God's order and structure, but I'm leaning into it and I'm in my gifting, I'm doing something that
Yeah.
I'm talented and gifted to do, my soul's at rest.
Hmm.
And yet I might be
Yeah.
real busy. I might be
Yeah.
real busy.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
Yeah.
I just said a lot.
It's
So I'll take a break.
no. No, it's really good, man. Because like when you like just starting to like unpack that a little bit. Um, as you mentioned, as far as when God ceased his work, he started a new work, the rule. And when I think about that, and as you mentioned, when you think about I'll call it the ultimate rest, when our soul is at rest, like the order. Um, and when I think about like the order, I think about the boundaries that God created.
Yeah.
When I think about the boundaries of what God created, you think about God told the water to stop here
Mm.
and to stop. God separated day and night,
Yep.
you know. So if we glean to that, we'll have to understand one of the biggest things for us as humans to ensure that we experience rest is that there has to be some type of order
Mm.
and boundaries that we are aligning ourselves to, you know.
Yep.
And I'm not just saying it, for those that believes in Jesus, but even for those that don't, you have to have some type of order, right? But even
Yep.
as followers, if we're truly understanding the order and the boundaries that God created, and we're following those things and knowing that it's a purpose, these are principles, we're able to partake in God's rest, you know.
Yep.
And as you mentioned, like our soul is at rest. So the question, Greg, I guess the question is, why don't we like why? And I guess why? Like, what gets in the way? And maybe to your point of us rethinking, starting to rethink it,
Yeah.
to really to shift our paradigm around it. What has gotten in the way from us not experiencing rest in your opinion?
Yeah, well, I think the Bible does a great job of leading us through the story that leads to where we're at today. And,
Mm,
that first creation account ends at the beginning of chapter 2. And the very next story that it goes into is the Adam and Eve story. And if you remember from an
yeah,
ancient
yeah.
context, again, pagan gods would create a temple, usually a building. We think of temples as
Mm,
building or structures with walls.
yeah.
They would
Hmm.
place their image within the temple and then they would rest on their throne, right? Well,
Hmm.
the biblical account lets me just think outside the box a little bit here. Garden of Eden's not a structure like a building, but
Mm-hmm.
really a temple, biblically speaking, is just a place of God's special presence. Well,
Yeah.
that's the Garden of Eden. And the Garden of
Mm-hmm.
Eden did have boundaries. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
there was the garden and then there wasn't the garden, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And because Adam and Eve got kicked out of something, and so it had to
Mm-hmm.
have had a boundary, a gate to
Yeah.
it, or
Mm-hmm.
whatever. At least theologically, talking about those things. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
and so, what was it?
Mm-hmm.
What's the Adam and Eve story? Because it's our story, really. I mean, that's the way we're supposed to read it. As
Yeah.
humanity, they are our
Yeah.
representatives. They're given boundaries, right? You're going to
Mm-hmm.
cultivate and keep. You've got a job to do. Cultivate and keep this thing I've created under the rules that I've created. And what are those rules? You can pretty much have reign of anything, except there's an off limits thing. It's that
Mm-hmm.
one tree.
Yeah. Yeah.
And when Adam and Eve started to consider whether they were going to partake of the fruit of the forbidden tree,
Mm-hmm.
it's not about an apple or a
Yeah.
pear
Yeah.
or whatever you
Yeah.
want to make it. It's
Mm-hmm.
if we've only gotten to that level in our thinking, we're missing the whole point. The
Miss-
whole point is they're challenging the structure and order that God created on the first 6 days of
Mm,
creation. The thing that
mm,
God said, it is very good. This is how everything works. Trust me. You don't need to have that wisdom, that
yeah.
ordering wisdom that tree will give you. I mean, the serpent was right. The serpent
Yeah.
said, you eat of that tree, you're going to be just like God. In
Mm,
that, you're going to know things that once you know them, you got to do God's work. And he's going to kick
mm,
you out of here. And then you got to go create your own order and structure. And you're not equipped to do that. You're not going to do well at it because you're going to think of only yourself.
mhm,
And, people talk about the world or God's kingdom sometimes being an upside down kingdom. I don't know if you've
mhm,
heard of that. Just because the rules seem so backwards, the last shall be
yeah.
first.
Mhm,
Don't take revenge when you really feel like you need some
yeah.
revenge.
Mhm,
um, Withhold yourself when your bodily urges tell you to, go do stuff, varying levels of, unbiblical things.
yeah.
um, that
Mhm,
the world in which we live, the thing we go out into every day and try and make sense of, that's the upside down world. That's the world where man has created his own structure and order, and it just doesn't seem right to us. That's where
yeah.
injustice comes from. This whole idea
Mhm,
of social justice is born out of something that's not being done correctly.
mhm,
And God is just telling us through these first two stories in the Old Testament that he's created an order. It leads to a place of soul rest where you can be functioning how you were made to function. And it's not fighting against God, it's leaning into his order and structure. And you're going to want to, because of the fall, because of that story of Adam and Eve, you're going to want to try and create your own structure and order. That's going to
mhm,
be your natural tendency.
mhm,
And so, really, if somebody considers them a Christ follower, a Christian, what
mhm,
they're really doing is they're giving up a whole lot of perceived uh, rights
yeah.
of I can go out there and do what I want in the way
Yeah.
that I want to. And they're saying I'm going to give up those rights and I'm going to sign on to a set of rules. And
Yeah.
it's not about the rules. It's not like,
Yeah.
rule
Yeah.
following, but
Yeah.
it's a way
Yeah.
this whole thing is supposed to work.
Yeah.
Um, that doesn't really show itself well. That image bearing, that's what humanity does, by the way. Day 6 says he made humanity in his image. And then
Mhm,
he gave him a job to do, go
yeah.
rule and subdue.
Yeah.
And so when we go out in the world, just think about
Yeah.
this for a second.
Yeah.
This is really cool. When we
Yeah.
go out in the world and we are following God's lead,
Mhm,
and doing things the way God would here on earth. It's not just WWJD, what would Jesus do thing. I
mm,
mean, that's part of it. but we are bearing God's image to a world that can't see him because he's not in physicality.
Mm.
And so when we go out there and treat people well with respect, and we don't take don't make decisions based solely on financial gain, and do the things that don't make sense in the worldly way of doing things,
Mhm.
and we're doing that because we're following God's lead, we're actually bearing his image to a world full of chaos
Yeah.
that's begging and desperately begging for his structure and order.
Yeah. 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 Totally. Family, we talking to Greg Hall, the author of Rethinking Rest, Why Our Approach to Sabbath Isn't Working. Something you mentioned, Greg, that just very recently has really stood out to me. And it's around stewardship. And I used to think, right, and I was not think is I was pondering this concept around something that I read around leadership, and it was separating um or yeah, separating what is a manager and what is a leader. And when I thought about it, I of course naturally gravitate to being a leader. You know, even in my 9 to 5, I'd rather be an informal leader than a formal leader, because in that formal leader perspective, it was a manager.
Hmm.
But
Yeah.
then I read and gotten more close to, in the beginning, what God commanded Adam and Eve to do. He told them to work the land. It's not yours. So if he's telling work the land, he's basically, I want you to manage what I
Yeah.
provided to you.
Yeah.
And Greg, that has hit me
Hmm.
in a way that I can't even explain, because it's I guess just a better appreciation of stewardship. And when I think about the work that God is asking, and I'm gonna say me, to do, it's almost, I ask the question, am I mismanaging what God has given me? Right. And when you think
Yes.
about the rest, am I mismanaging the rest?
Hmm. Author of Hebrews says, "Be diligent to enter that rest." And the whole book is written to people that already believe.
Mm-hmm.
And there's some debate in Hebrews, if you get real Bible nerdy, geeky, what the warning passages are, who they're talking to.
Yeah.
But the whole book's written to believing people. And the
Mm-hmm.
author is talking to you and me.
Yeah.
And he's saying, be diligent to enter that rest, because there's a chance you won't.
Mm.
And you'll still be a believer, but there's a chance you won't ever enter the rest. And what's our biblical example of that? That group that came out of Egypt, out of slavery in Egypt,
Mm-hmm.
had a
Mm-hmm.
chance to enter the promised land, which
Yeah.
was, by the way, referred to as a land of rest. It
Mm-hmm.
was the place where God's rule was going to be lived out.
Mm-hmm.
And God was saying, go into your rest. And they sent in the spies and they came back. 10 of them said, absolutely not. We should
Yeah.
not go there.
Yeah.
They are too
Yeah.
big and too strong.
Yeah.
And Joshua and Caleb said, yes, I think we could.
Good.
And they forfeited. Now, they're still believers. God's still following them for 40 years, giving
Mm-hmm.
them manna every morning,
Yeah.
giving them
Yeah. Yeah.
guidance as they
Mm-hmm.
went. So it's not like they lost their relationship with God
Yeah.
during that
Yeah.
40 years. They just lost an opportunity to live at rest.
Mm-hmm.
And if that was true of them, the New Testament oftentimes uses that generation of people as an example for us not to follow.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And if that was true of them, the author of Hebrews, what his or her message, because we don't know who wrote Hebrews,
Mm-hmm.
um, uh, the message that the author is giving us is there's an opportunity to live at rest as a believer, but you can choose not to.
Mm.
And that's frightening because,
Yeah.
most people just think I come to faith in God, or, become a Jesus follower, and all of a sudden I've experienced his everything he's got for me. But
Mm.
that just
Mm.
suggests that part of the rest that he has to offer is, well, look at Jesus' statement, okay? Matthew
Yeah.
11:28 through 30.
Hmm.
Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I'll give you rest. The very next thing he says is, take my yoke upon you. Well, what's a
Yeah.
yoke?
Yeah.
People today don't understand what a yoke is. It is a
Yeah.
instrument of work.
Hmm.
Jesus is saying, you want to enter into my rest, true
Hmm.
soul rest, you're going to hitch yourself under the constraints of my yoke.
Mm.
I'm going
Mm.
to then be not just the the partner alongside you, pulling with you in my humanity, Jesus, but he's also the one behind, holding the reins and directing where that yoked person goes.
Yeah.
So, you get the picture of like two oxen with a
Hmm.
yoke on them. And if I'm the farmer, I can lead them to where they're going to be most useful. I
Yeah.
know as the farmer where that is. The ox don't have a clue.
Hmm. Hmm.
I mean, I've never seen two cows out in the middle of a field looking for a yoke and trying to put
Hmm.
it on them themselves.
Yeah.
They're just wandering around and they're not getting
Yeah.
much done. And sometimes I feel like that too,
Hmm.
just sort of wandering around, wondering where it is. But there's a God. If the Bible is true, and
Hmm.
I've got a decision I've made about that. But if the if the Bible is true, if this whole story actually makes sense and
Hmm.
is reality, there's there's a God who understands who I am better than I do.
Hmm.
He understands how I'm gifted. He
Mm.
understands where my gifting is going to do the most good to bring
Yeah.
his image into the world. And I just got to realize I don't know those things. So I need to be open to more than just what I think
Yeah.
uh, about
Yeah.
how this whole thing is supposed to work.
Yeah. It's amazing. When you think about, I was I I wish I had some notes here, but I was studying Philippians,
Yeah.
and in in Philippians, and just kind of reading some additional commentary, they were kind of describing different peace. You know, you have somewhat the like, peace be with you. um Jesus was like to give us peace, and I think you also like describing God of peace, you know, and how all those different things are different illustration of peace is what we have access to, right? And when you think about our lives, and just like, when I think about my relationship with God, and to your point of, and you may have, like, not you have mentioned, but you mentioned of this opportunity that we have to allow God to do it for us, but we choose not to. It's almost where we have to die to ourselves,
Mm.
you know.
Well, yeah.
Exactly, as Paul has mentioned, that we have to die to this flesh, and allow God to lead us. And it's so amazing when we're able to trust God in those moments of the peace and the rest. And I'm kind of using those in synonymally, but it's to me, it's almost a peace that comes over. And to your point of, your soul is at rest because your soul is at peace. You
Hmm.
know, this is why, when you think about, of again, my relationship with God. Now I'm keep saying it because I can't say what other relationships with God is, right? And I think that's where the work kind of comes in, right? It's not like, oh yeah, you go to church and you follow Jesus, now you're gonna be at rest. No, that's not how it works. You're gonna more and more each day, you're gonna be losing yourself, you
Yeah.
know, continue to die to yourself and really think about eat the daily bread that God gives us, right? That God
Yeah.
gives you, right? So it's
Yep.
a daily thing, you know. And when I think about that and just think about the rest portion of it, it's amazing when we're able to release ourselves and surrender
Mm.
of how much we're able to gain from that, you
Yeah.
know. um it's so amazing to where at the all this time, and I'm kind of rambling. I promise him I'll kind of
No, you're good. You're good.
connect it too, but I'm processing these thoughts is where once you're able to come to a moment of releasing, how God is able to give you that rest, that unspeakable rest. And when you think about the peace of the chaos that occurs in this world, and it's not that you are completely immune to it, that you don't get troubled, but you don't stay in that state, because
You're
you
not
you
sucked
know
into it. Yeah.
or get sucked into it, right?
Yeah.
Um, it's because you know that God's in control.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
I have given myself to God, and He's ordering me, He's protecting me, you know. And when I
Yep.
think about just how God rests upon us, like that of itself is so deep to me, you know.
Yeah.
Because I recently changed my prayer. And it was one of the things like God just kind of speaks to me like, hey, just kind of hit me upside the head at times. Um, but I recently changed my prayer to kind of get a better understanding of this rest that God is resting upon us. Is that I used to say, God, I welcome your presence in my day.
Mm.
And God he had to like put me like, hey, brother, I already been here. How can you welcome me something when I'm omnipresent? I'm all over.
Yeah.
It's like, do you receive? Can you receive my presence? And that of itself, Greg, it has challenged me in so many different ways,
Yeah.
because it's like, can you receive God's presence? And that of itself is like, oh, I got to make sure I'm in the right posture, you know.
Yep.
And when you think about that rest of, can I do that daily to receive? When I think about, just again the story of Jesus, and I love how some people have said it's just a pure love story. It's like at the end of the day, it's not how many prayers you do, or I mean, church, can you receive God into you? All you have to do is receive. It's like
Yep.
that's all you
Yep.
have to do. But it is the hardest thing to do.
Yeah. And when we think about rest, getting again further away from that 1 day a week
Hmm.
physical cessation of manual labor or whatever type of work we do, if we can get further away from that idea and lean more in on this idea of, what God has a place for your soul,
Mm,
where that Hebrew word for rested, when it says that in chapter 2 of Genesis that God placed Adam in the garden, it
mm,
literally that's a Hebrew word for rested. You could
mm,
translate that God rested Adam in the garden
mm,
because that's his place of rest. That's where he's
mm.
busy doing work,
Yeah.
but it's work within parameters, it's work
Mm,
within his gifting.
mm-hmm.
And sometimes we fight against not just the parameters, but we also fight against the type of work that we're good at.
Yeah.
That, I like to say everybody has something that they do that when they're done doing it, they're just like, oh, yeah, that's my sweet spot.
Yeah. Yeah.
For me, and I know this is not everybody's, but presenting in front of people ideas. And that can be from a biblical concept, or that can be I've been a presenter in many different contexts.
Mm-hmm.
I was a public school teacher for a while, and when I get done doing that thing, I'm
Yeah.
usually pretty jazzed. I mean, I'm exhausted, by the way, because I've just spent all my energy putting it into the structure and planning and whatever, I was talking about. But when I'm done, I'm just jazzed about it.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I know that's exactly where I'm supposed to be.
Yeah.
And so the next question is, how do I get there more often?
Yeah.
How do I
Yeah.
how do I find my way there instead of maybe fighting against it? And sometimes, because of our Adam and Eve complex, sometimes we make decisions that puts us in places in life that are far away from where God would have us be. I mean, maybe we've made poor decision financially, and then we
Yeah.
had to take a job that was outside of our gifting. It's
Mm-hmm.
just a total drag, and I can't get up for it in the morning. And
Yeah.
I mean, we've all found ourselves, I think, in that spot one time or another, or maybe the
Mm-hmm.
majority of time. But this concept of rest, if Sabbath is really just trying to find the place where God would have you be, letting
Mm-hmm.
him lead you to that, that's a
Yeah.
daily thing. That's
Yeah.
not it can't be once a week, because we'll screw it up in the other 6 days so much that once a week doesn't do anything. I mean,
So
it's
true.
literally got to be, and I've got, sorry, I went off mic there.
No, you're good.
Made these wristbands because in my book I talk about the WWJD from the 1990s. What would
Mm-hmm.
Jesus do? The bumper stickers and
Yeah.
wristbands. So
Yeah.
I created my own wristbands, and I put a new acronym on it. I don't know if you can see that.
Yeah. I can see that.
It's WMPTBATTD question mark,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
which is just kind of a parody. What's my place to be and thing to do?
Mm.
And so when I put these on in the morning, and I've ordered like 1,000 of them, so I got a whole box here. But
Okay.
I literally am asking myself every morning when I put that thing on, as silly as it is, right? Because it's just a
Yes. Yeah.
wristband. But
Mm-hmm.
as silly as that is, I'm looking at those letters and I'm going, okay, I have a choice today.
Mm-hmm.
What's my place to be? And is that my decision, or is God going to have any say in it?
Mm.
And when I put that on, what I'm telling myself, this is my own little mantra,
Yeah. Yeah.
is God God's going to bring something across my plate today that's not on my agenda. And I'm going to decide ahead of time, before whatever it is that happens. I'm just going to decide to be open to whatever it is that God brings. And if that means changing my plans or rerouting my direction, I I just kind of need to be open to that. We've all had those conversations in
Yeah.
life that just we bump into somebody and then it's like, oh my gosh, why? How did I just have that conversation with that person? I
Mhm.
would have never planned that, and
Yeah.
yet different perspective or different opportunity, or that's just God connecting dots for us,
Yeah.
pulling on the reins a little bit. If we can see it that way,
Mm-hmm.
I think I think it's a little bit easier to um, be led. I
Yeah.
think it's really rough for Americans, especially, to be led. We don't
Mm.
like that concept. But,
Yeah.
Jesus' example in the garden, your kingdom come. Now it's
Mm.
his kingdom because he's God, but
Yeah. Yeah.
in his humanity, he's got some in the Garden of Gethsemane, he's got something right in front of him that he does not want to walk into. And
Yeah.
he even asks if there's any way to get out of this. I'm
Yeah.
open to
Yeah.
it, right?
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
But
Yeah.
not my will, not what I'm hoping for or dreaming about, but your will be done.
It will be done.
It's an unbelievable example
Yeah.
of how we're supposed to go about just our daily lives.
Yeah. Yeah.
What is
Yeah.
it?
Yeah. It's an unbelievable, like to your point, example, and just that posture, you know, to be in that type of posture of receiving, right?
Yep.
Because I know for me, I had to get over the shame. I had to get over the I'm not worthy of it,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
and that's a continuous thing, you know. Once I am able to do that and to be in that posture of receiving is when you think about like far as humility, you know, it helps me to practice that. Helps me understand that I didn't create nothing. This podcast is not mine, you know. This body is not mine, it's the Lord's. And to your point, is it has for me is that daily reminder. And I'm glad that what you are doing is prompting you to have that moment of where we need, and I call it for me, is we need to eat the daily bread.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, we need like this is my daily bread. And to what you say is like it helps me to understand that I am totally dependent on God.
Hmm.
I can't
Yeah.
I can't do it in my own strength.
And we forget that, right? I mean, because
Yeah.
that's that upside kingdom out in the world that
Hmm.
doesn't operate the way Jesus's kingdom does
Yeah.
tells us constantly that we've if it is to be, it's because of me, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, that's kind
Yeah.
of the mantra out there is you got to make it happen. You want to
You
get
gotta make
somewhere
it.
in life, it's got to be you. It's got to be you doing it. And
Hmm.
sometimes that's taking advantage of people and
Yeah.
that, you know, and that's making
Yeah.
a job decision based on how much the job pays versus
Yeah.
how much it feeds your soul.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Yeah.
Jesus's whole message is, it gives it gives purpose to those things that he's calling us to. Like like you said, humility. Humility is a hard sell. I mean, it's just a hard sell. It's I'm trying to talk somebody into being humble. Come
Yeah. Yeah.
on. I mean, why? But
Yeah.
when you have a worldview that says, you know what,
Hmm.
somebody else is in control and somebody else has set the rules and somebody else knows how this thing runs the best and how you're going to sleep well at night,
Yeah. Yeah.
all of a sudden humility isn't a hard sell. It gives
Mm.
purpose to humility and it becomes something along with all the other traits that God's calling us to that seem very natural at times. It
Yeah.
gives purpose to not coveting other people's stuff.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
don't covet another person's spouse or their
Hmm.
possessions. Well, the
Hmm.
world would tell you that's step number one. That's where you
Hmm.
start.
Hmm. Hmm.
And God just says, you know what? When you lean into the concept of you've got enough,
Hmm.
or I'll lead you to the place where you'll have enough,
Hmm.
all of a sudden, uh, I don't have to worry about my friend's boat down the street,
Yeah.
how big their house is, what kind of job they have.
Hmm.
I just know I'm where I'm supposed to be.
Yeah. Where I
And
was
that's
supposed to. Yeah.
awesome. I mean, that's
Yeah.
awesome.
Yeah.
And I so I just wrote a book and everybody's a lot, not everybody. A lot of people have written books. It's kind of like podcasting, right? Almost everybody has
Hmm.
a podcast, but not everybody does. That's a falsity. Um, and the world says, here's how you have a successful book launch. And people will ask me, how's the book launch going? And it's like, you know what? It's not for me. I didn't do it to sell books and make money. I, I mean, if that happens, great. And I'll
Yeah.
I'll pursue those ends. I mean, me just talking to you today is part of
Hmm.
pursuing, trying to let people know what God's told me.
Hmm.
And if that has wings of its own, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Um, but I
Yeah.
was called to write this book.
Hmm.
And God showed me something when I started studying Hebrews that has just changed my complete perspective on how I live my life. And it's so dramatic in my life that it's like, even if two or three other people get on board, get this concept, and have a rethinking moment, this is good.
It was good. It was good.
Yeah.
You went out and you invested your talents, man. You know,
Yeah.
you didn't hold on to it. You didn't put it in the ground. And sometimes I have to continue to remind myself of that. At the end of the day, if one person listen to this podcast or gets influence, or if I'm able to influence someone to have a purpose driven lifestyle, that's around faith and well-being and leadership, I have done my job.
Yeah.
I am where I supposed to be. And I love how you said that. um I guess just like one or two more questions, Greg. I guess to make it plain and simple, what do you want readers to leave away with from this
Yeah.
book?
Um, so, uh, yeah, great question. um, what would I like to be a takeaway? If uh, if you are a person who has leaned in on a certain understanding of what Sabbath rest is, and that's been mostly focused on 1 day a week,
Mhm.
I would just love for you to be able to back away from that table, not completely forget about it, because that's a
Yeah.
picture of a part of what it is. I mean, the New Testament calls the Sabbath day a shadow, and
Mhm.
it says the substance of that shadow, meaning the thing casting that shadow, is Christ. It's in Colossians chapter 2. And so if I can back away from the shadows and focus in on, okay, what is it that God is actually offering me? What is it that the author of Hebrews is encouraging me to be diligent to get into,
Mhm.
that I might miss out on it
Yeah.
if I'm not paying attention?
Mhm.
Um, and it just makes a whole lot more sense that we can, that people know people know when they're in their gifting, when they're doing something that they're called to do.
Yeah.
Their soul calls them to it, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
And I guess just talking to your listeners right now, there are people who have heard either today or yesterday or sometime in the last month or in the last year, you had a conversation with somebody. God kind of spoke to you, and however God speaks to you, through his word or through your prayer life, in
Mhm.
some way, you've gotten some idea over the last little bit of something that you might need to be open to. And I don't know what that is, because their thing is going to be different than mine thing. I'm looking for things that I'm gifted in, and when those come across my plate, I'm very sensitive to those. I don't
Mhm.
just toss them out the window. I say, I might want to, I would never choose that, but I'm going to try it. And I just call that testing the waters of rest. I'm a swimmer, and I hate getting in cold water. And so I have this, I have this uh, thing that I do, this segmented way of getting into the water, where I'll sit on the edge of the pool, I'll dip 1 foot in, I'll splash some water on my body. This is all just, postponing the inevitable,
Mhm.
because I'm going to be
Mhm.
swimming soon. But it's that initial shock that sometimes keeps us from diving in.
Yeah.
And if we take that into our everyday life situations, sometimes when we feel like we've got to jump all into something for us to
Mhm.
really do it, that can prevent us from even trying it.
Mhm.
And sometimes God just wants you to try something, and
Yeah.
maybe you won't even succeed at it.
Mhm.
He just wants you to try it, so you know that, oh, maybe not this circumstance, but maybe in a different venue, I could
Mhm.
do that.
Mhm.
And you would never think that way otherwise. So pay attention to what God's calling you to, what he has
Mm.
maybe put on your plate recently.
Yeah.
Maybe it's a phone call that you haven't returned, a
Mhm.
text that you didn't get back to, because it's like, I don't really know if I want to
Mhm.
just, it doesn't have to be all in. You don't have to say, I'm fully committed to this thing. All
Mhm.
God wants you to do is trust him.
Mhm.
And I think it's going to become apparent once you test those waters. Oh, yeah, this is a good fit. Man, I
Yeah.
wish I would have done this earlier. Or it could be, oh, this isn't right at all. I'm
Yeah.
so glad I didn't jump in
Yeah.
because now
Yeah.
I can just dodge my way out of this and maybe God has something else for me. And I've
Hmm.
learned something from that experience. So I think that's kind of the attitude that I've adopted on a daily basis is, I've got a plan for my day every morning.
Hmm.
And I'm also got some margin built in to just whatever happens. If
Yeah.
it's a God thing, especially, I'm going to give credence to that.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like you answer my second question about finishing what you start.
Uh-huh.
And just as you mentioned, just answering the call um, of that God calling, and to try it
Yeah.
really resonates. Now I know that's going to resonate with a lot of people when we think about finishing what we start. How can people get in contact with you, Greg? And also order the book. It's on Amazon, but if there's any other areas that you want to promote on how to get in contact with you or how to order the book.
Yeah. So, just Google the book Rethinking Rest. It'll come up on Amazon and Barnes and Noble and Christianbooks.com, I think is totally blanked on the site there.
Hmm.
um, uh, One other thing that I'd like to mention is I have a fully developed a small group study, which can also
Okay.
be done by individuals. So, in the
Hmm.
front of each chapter in my book, I've got a QR code that takes you straight to a free Bible study on that chapter. And it's one that I taught in my church, and it's free of charge. So you get the book, and that's available to you. I've also got my podcast, like you said earlier, Rethinking Scripture podcast, and the associated websites with both of those. So rethinkingscripture.com and rethinkingrest.com. And that's kind of how people can get in touch with me. I've got a contact tab there. They can reach out to me. I'd love hearing feedback, and if this is resonating with people, that's always good. I've
Yeah.
got a last thing. Sorry,
No, good.
I got a trip to Israel coming up. That I've led
Oh, wow.
several trips to Israel. I've taken a
Hmm.
few years off because of the pandemic, like
Hmm.
everybody did. But next February, I'm doing a 10-day trip to Israel. So if somebody's interested themselves or even knows of somebody that might be interested, all that information is at rethinkingscripture.com. They can go there and
Okay.
check it out.
All right. We'll definitely do that. Greg Hall, thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us today on Happy of the Podcast Family. Definitely go get the book. Go get the book. Rethinking Rest: Why Our Approach to Sabbath Isn't Working. Greg, I want to thank you for joining me in the neighborhood. Hey, family. Wow, what a wonderful episode. I hope and pray that it has definitely blessed your heart. But know this. Know that you were created for greatness. So no matter what life brings you, set goals, say prayers, and finish what you start. Till next time, love God, love your neighbor, love yourself. I'm your favorite neighbor, Jay Murray. Be blessed.